Dan I met through the monetary reform movement, and I came to understand that Dan's a very independent thinker. He's a director of an organization called Saving Communities in Pittsburgh, and I think with that I'm going to let him carry on.
The title of this is Land, Money, and Privilege Free Trade. I was once chairman of the Allegheny County Greens, and I've been chairman of the Allegheny County Libertarian. The Greens left me. I didn't leave the Greens so much as the Greens got taken over by people who were far more socialist than the original Greens. But with the Libertarians, I run into people who say, well, you know, we didn't need to put an end to slavery. The free market would have ended slavery. And I said, how can you have a free market if there's slavery? Obviously, when you're buying and selling slaves, you're buying and selling privileges. You have a privilege as a master over the slave, and you're transferring the privilege to somebody else. And slavery is, chattel slavery is over, but there are still privileges that exist within the market. And so the idea is that a true free trade has to be privilege free. And if there is privilege in the system, you run into problems where it's not free trade. The other thing is free trade is between people trade. And so this is my problem with the people on the left. They say, well, it has to be fair trade. And it's like, well, there's two people trading. If one of them thinks it's not fair, there's no trade. So on the one hand, the conservative or libertarian view is that it's automatically free trade if the two people agree to it. And the liberal view, or the more modern liberal socialist progressive view, is that it's not free trade unless it's fair according to some other party than the two people making the trade. So my approach to this is that if it's not a free trade, if it's not a fair trade and it is a free trade, there has to be privilege embedded in it somewhere. And so I look at this now. Again, the libertarian view is, let's say Japan. We send Japan money, and Japan sends us stuff. We're not sending Japan money. We're sending money to some business person who's in Japan, and that business is sending us stuff. So again, trade is between people. It's not between countries. People just happen to be in different countries. Now, if I want to trade with you, I have to pay an income tax on any profits I make in the trade, and you have to pay a sales tax, and I have to collect the sales tax from you and forward it to the government. So we actually have tariffs between ourselves. We don't call them tariffs because we only call it a tariff if it's across the border. But we have taxes that interfere with me trading with you. And so the question of whether it's a free trade doesn't just apply to governments. But the idea is we send them money, and then what is Japan going to do with the money? They don't just sit on the money, they have to buy our stuff, because what good is money? Money loses value. Well, the stuff loses value too. The Toyotas wear out eventually and stuff. But you get utility out of the Toyota and before it wears out, where the money has no utility unless you spend it. So they have to buy our stuff. So we send money to them, they send us stuff. Then they send the money back to us, and we send them stuff. Problem is solved depending on what you mean by stuff. Because stuff is like a catch-all term. It's a highly technical libertarian term. And so let's look at the stuff Japan sells. Well, they sell us cars and audio equipment, electronics, machinery, semi-finished steel. But what kind of stuff do they buy? Well, they buy raw food. That makes sense because Japan is a tiny, tiny country with this large, dense population. They cannot grow food for themselves. So it absolutely makes sense. We have lots of land, not that many people. They have lots of people, not that much land. So it makes sense that they would manufacture things in order to buy food. Now the other side of that is that our auto workers are very well paid. Our farm workers are very poorly paid. So our food is a better deal because our food is grown with cheaper labor. And I was once an organizer for the United Farm Workers, so I would go as far as to say that our farm workers were underpaid according to the market, maybe not, but there's something that bothers me about how little our farm workers are paid. They also buy fuel. They buy coal and oil. Japan has very few natural resources. Their semi-finished steel is made from electric furnaces, and the electricity is powered, a lot of it, by West Virginia coal. And then I run into how is this efficient that we mine the coal in West Virginia, put it on barges, float it down the Ohio and down the Mississippi, all the way to New Orleans, put it on international tankers, ship it to Japan, they burn it, they make steel, they ship that steel all the way back to the United States. As a pure efficiency question, it's like, why can't we do that better here for less money? And the fact of the matter is that no matter what you say, they are doing it. It appears to be more efficient because they're making a profit doing that. So that leads us to the question. The other thing, though, is they bought land. The big argument that Japan was dumping was really seriously pressed in 1979. The head of the U.S. Steel said, Japan is dumping, they're selling Toyotas for less in the United States than you can buy them in Japan. And the steel workers, in 1979 we also started closing steel mills. But land is not stuff in the same sense that everything else is stuff. Land does not wear out and become worthless after 10 years. Land keeps getting more valuable. The other thing is they started buying up debt. They started buying public and private debt. Not as much as China has, but they bought up public and private debt. And they bought intellectual property. Sony Pictures now owns most of our, not most, they own a lot of our copyrighted movies that were made maybe in the 40s or 50s. The copyrights now belong to Sony Corporation.
Hey, Dan, you said they buy debt, and that was a phrase that always gave me trouble. What that really means is they're loaning us money, right?
They're loaning us money, or we borrow the money from somebody else and they buy our obligation to pay it back.
Yeah, so it's a lending process.
It's a lending process, yeah. So, so these three things are what I want to focus on because those are fundamentally different from all the other stuff. All the other stuff is labor-created property. And land titles and debt money and intellectual property, those are all law-created property. And we'll take a look at each one of those. But there's 4 causes of dumping. Japan dumped to buy foreign land. China dumps, we get cheap stuff from China, they give us stuff, and then they buy our national debt with it, and also our state, and they're buying bonded debt is held by Japan quite a bit. Not too much personal debt because we do have restrictions on banks being foreign owned. But Ireland has been exporting forever. Ever since England conquered the Irish, they have been exporting wealth. And even to this day, they are exporting wealth because they're still substantially absentee owned. And Brazil started dumping to pay foreign debts. So there's really only two issues here. There's land and debts. And you can dump to buy foreign land so people will rent from you forever, or to buy up foreign debts so people will be paying you off forever, or you can be dumping because somebody else has taken your land and you have to pay rents to foreigners, or that you have to pay debts and interest on debts to foreigners. And Brazil is the big interest payer. When we look at Japan, Prop 13 passed in 1978. Prop 13 curtailed property taxes. It almost froze assessments. Assessments can only go up 2% a year. And the land in California, ever since Prop 13, land in California has been going up by about 10% a year. It's going up faster than in any other state. In the first 18 months after Prop 13, foreign ownership of California land doubled. Now, you can only buy California land with US dollars. So if Japanese businesses want to buy California land, if they see that as a better deal than just investing in their own manufacturing, they will want those US dollars. So they will encourage companies to sell us Toyotas and Sonys and stuff so that they can take that money and buy California land. Japan, after about 10 years, Japan owned 40% of Los Angeles, of the value of Los Angeles. And that's Japanese owned it. Again, it's not countries. That trade is not between countries, it's between people. But Japanese interests own 40% of Los Angeles. So California was flush with money. This Prop 13, boy, what a great thing that was. Well, suppose you sold your house. You had a house, you owned it free and clear, you sold it, and then rented it back from the people you sold it to. Well, you would be flush with money for a while. And California has had that benefit for a while, but not forever. Again, that's 1979 is when we started accusing them of dumping. And that same year, Pittsburgh had a land value tax. We had a property tax that was higher on land than it was on buildings. And we doubled the land portion only in 79, raised it again in 80, raised it again in 82, raised it again in 84, and raised it again in 90. At the beginning, our land tax was twice the rate of the building tax. By 1990, it was 6 times the rate of the building tax. And we had a massive building boom, and we didn't have a real estate price boom. So we didn't attract outside speculators who wanted to buy up land and sit on it. Buying up land and sitting on it was very expensive, but buying up land and developing it was pretty cheap because you have a brand new building and the tax rate on the building is still pretty low. In 2008, California led the nation in mortgage foreclosures, and Pittsburgh had the fewest per capita. This brings us into the free trade argument. All of the classical liberals that I know of, there's some that criticized unlimited property and land and didn't specifically call for a land value tax. These explicitly called for a land value tax. Others, like William Cobbett, he's known as the father of free trade. He said, "You who free the land will do more for your country than we who have freed its trade." So there is this notion that the right thing to tax is land values. And just to explain what a land value tax is quickly, this is how property tax works. They assess the value of the land, they assess the value of the building, they add them together, that's your property value. But because much of the value is in the building, the tax on a well-maintained building is much, much higher than the tax on a derelict building or a vacant lot. And sometimes that property might be worth more if you tore the building down than it is with that old building on it. So the taxes collected on a vacant lot are very low. And it makes it less profitable to fix up the building and more profitable to buy up that vacant lot and sit on it and hope the Urban Redevelopment Authority will come through and bail you out or something. Land value tax, the tax is the same on both properties. No matter how well it's kept up, the tax is the same. Now, the tax in the poorest neighborhood might be 1/100th of the tax in the richest neighborhood, because the land value in the richest neighborhood is very high. So everybody wants to live in the richest neighborhood. And in Pittsburgh, the richest neighborhood, a lot is 85 times as high as the poorest neighborhood, but the lots in the richest neighborhood are real small. And the lots in the poorest neighborhood are bigger because that used to be, back when lots were large, that was is when all those houses were built. So the privilege itself, the word privilege means private legislation. It was a contraction in Roman, so there are two Roman words that mean private and legislation, and they got contracted in Latin to the root word of privilege. So people talk about white privilege or male privilege or any number of privileges, and if there's not legislation, to me, we have degraded the word privilege to mean just advantage. That, you know, if white people have an advantage, it's not a legal advantage anymore because we don't have Jim Crow laws anymore. When there were Jim Crow laws, it was actually privilege. When it's just social perception, it's still an advantage, but it's not privilege in the original sense. And we now say things like legal privilege. If we mean what privilege used to mean, we say legal privilege. And people say, well, what's a law that affects, if you say male privilege, what's a law that affects men and women differently? Well, the draft. I don't consider that male privilege, but you know, that's a law that benefits actually women at the expense of men. So taking that idea of privilege, land titles were seen by all the classical liberals as privileges. Land titles did not exist before the state. Tenure in land existed because tenure is necessary for the full use of land. We have to have property in land unless we're going to live as a nomadic society. Nomads didn't have property in land at all. American Indians, because most of them did some amount of farming, if you cleared some land and planted it, that land was yours until the harvest. And then after the harvest was over, it became everybody's land. So the property in land was subordinate to the property and the fruits of your labor. And there were limits. All the classical liberals had an idea that there were limits to your right. You could appropriate land, but within limits. One limit was occupancy and use. If you're not using the land, how do you get to claim that it's yours? The other is that you're limited by the equal rights of others. If I grab up so much land that other people can't take up land and use it, then I have pushed my rights beyond the limits and deprived other people of their rights. And this was expressed by what's called the Lockean proviso. John Locke, when he wrote about property, said you have a right to take up land as long as there's enough and as good left to others. Well, you never do that because you always take the best land. If there's land available to be used, you always take the best land first. And he didn't actually say you couldn't do that. He said you didn't have you couldn't just do it by right. You couldn't do it without any permission from the rest of the community. Ricardo is a classical liberal. He came up with the law of rent. And the law of rent equalizes all this stuff. Let's say there's some land, there's different grades of land. The trees are just symbolic. It doesn't mean anything particular. But on the best land, you can get 4 units of wealth. With the same amount of work on the next best category, you can get 3, 2, and 1. And let's say 1 is what you need to survive. If you're only getting 1 unit of wealth, then you're working for starvation wages. So the first person is going to take up the best land. And other people come along, and there's more land than he needs. So other people will come along, and they will all take up the best land. And when the best land is all taken up, then the next person along will accept land that produces 3 units of wealth. Well, this becomes the wages, and the 4 units of wealth becomes the rent. Because this guy is actually getting 4, not because he's working harder, but because he has the better land. And if he decided that he didn't want to work, or he was getting old and retiring or something, and somebody came along and said, well, I will work that land, he would rent it to him. He would say, well, if you pay me one bushel of whatever that is, I'll let you keep the other 3. And that's as good a deal as he would get taking up new land. So Ricardo said that's the natural rent. As people get pushed to poorer and poorer land, the rent gets to be higher and higher, and the wages get to be lower and lower. Malthus said people get poorer because they overpopulate, but Ricardo said no, it's not that all the land is used. People have grabbed up land and held it out of use, especially the nobles. So if you ever read Malthus, Malthus was defending the nobles against William Godwin. Malthus was making excuses for the landlords who had taken enclosed all the land, pushed people into poverty. And Ricardo says, no, the poverty is because the land has been taken up, but this guy would not normally use this. Now, suppose you shared the rent. You know, rent is the equalizer. So if you shared that rent, there's 6 units of wealth that are going as rent and 4 units that are going as wages. If you took that as 6 units of wealth and distributed them on a per capita basis, then everybody would have, instead of 1, they would have 2.5. And everybody would be prosperous. If you collected half the rent, then this guy would still have 1 3/4 instead of just enough to survive, and the others would still get some advantage from their holding better land. To bring this back to the trade issue, this was the Dutch buying Manhattan from the Indians. And it's like, well, we bought Manhattan from the Indians for $24 worth of stuff, and the thought was, boy, those Indians were stupid. But we're selling our land for Toyotas, and it never occurred to us that the Japanese are doing to us exactly what we were doing to the Indians. Except that we know what a land title is, and these Indians didn't have, they didn't know they were selling the land in perpetuity because it was a European land title system. They didn't have it. But this concept of free trade, if you're giving your land in order to get things that wear out, then who's it unfair to? It's unfair to your grandchildren, because those Toyotas will be gone long before your grandchildren can use them. And they will be renting from Japanese interests. The second was to acquire debt. China is communist at the top, it's capitalist at the bottom. It always was like that. There was always a black market in China. The Chinese have a saying that's way older than Mao, it's way older than the last 3 dynasties. It's, the mountains are high and the emperor is far away. And what that means is that China is too big and too rugged and mountainous and too decentralized for anybody to actually control it. So the great Chinese empires would take tribute from all over China, but they pretty much let each little warlord do what it wanted to do. And so China has always had this very free enterprise to the point of anarchy in the bad sense of the word. The Chinese, You will take something to China and they will send you'll say, we ordered this, product and what you sent us was junk, and they say, too bad. And the court system, there are not many standards in China, and that's only beginning to change because foreign countries won't deal with them. We find lead in the paint in our kids' toys, and it comes down on all the Chinese manufacturers, and they start saying, okay, we're going to start preventing that. But Nixon opened up trade. That was in the early 70s. And China was not ready for that, so we didn't get much from China for a while. And the land prices, they didn't do what Japan did because land prices in California were already ridiculous. The land prices in the country, generally, we were toward the end of a land price boom. So the Chinese had all this American money. The inflation ended, but the interest rates were still higher than what Chinese profit margins were. So Chinese were making money and their profit margins were low because they didn't have to overcome interest. They could borrow money cheaply from the Chinese government. They didn't have to overcome a high interest rate. They had all this American money. They bought American debt. And now they're buying foreign land as well. But they were buying American debt because what else could they do with American dollars? They were producing stuff so cheaply that they said, why would we buy American stuff when we can make it this cheaply? But we have American money. What can you buy with American money? Well, you can buy bonds, and the bonds you'll make a bigger profit on the bonds than you will on investing in more manufacturing in China. So the money and debt, or the land titles and the money titles, are the two big cornerstones of the progressive movement before it became socialistic. And that takes us to banking privilege. Banks create money by monetizing credit, and what that means, you want to buy a car, and you need $20,000 toward your car. You can make your down payment and get a $20,000 loan. So you give the bank an IOU for $20,000. That's your loan contract. And then the bank gives you a check for $20,000. And you put that check in another bank, and that $20,000 now circulates as money. So 95% of the money in circulation came from commercial banks in just that way. Car loans, mortgages, student loans, commercial loans for businesses. Huge amount of money created out of thin air by banks. They didn't lend you if I deposited money in the bank, they didn't lend you for my deposit. I can still go to the bank and take out my deposit anytime I want to. They are required to have a certain minimal reserve in case somebody takes out cash. And they've made it harder and harder to take out cash. And if you do take out cash, they immediately put you under investigation as a possible drug lord. The reason for that is largely because the banks don't want people to take out cash. There's a thing called shadow banking, and shadow banking is where banks create bank credits and companies trade them, and those bank credits are not negotiable for taxes. They are not legal. They're not in any way commingled with legal tender. But this money, if you have to pay your taxes, you have to pay taxes with borrowed money. Now, it doesn't matter whether you borrowed it. Somebody had to borrow it. The money wouldn't exist if somebody hadn't borrowed it. And when we have a recession, it's because either the banks quit lending or people quit borrowing. They said, I can't handle any more debt, or the bank said, you're not good for any more debt. And they curtail it. When the bank lends you money, it creates additional money, puts it in circulation. When the bank stops lending money, as people pay back their loans, that money comes out of circulation. So the whole monetary system collapses every time banks stop lending money or slow down lending money. And the value of the money is created by producers. And that if you've ever had an economics class, one of the first things, what is inflation? Inflation is too much money chasing too few goods. Well, if that's what inflation is, who created the value that attaches the money? Well, the people who produce the goods, right? Because if we were producing more goods, the prices would remain stable and there wouldn't be inflation. It's too few goods. So there were two movements against this. The question I have is, how is it just that we're taxing the people who are producing the goods when we could have just put the new money into circulation by reducing their taxes? So while we're taxing the people who produced real wealth, we are giving the banks the privilege of creating money out of thin air and lending it to us. So the Greenbacker movement came after Abraham Lincoln was trying to wage the Civil War, and the bankers wanted 36% interest on, and he says, well, 36% interest, the war's over, because we will lose, because the banks will win the war. And the Chicago Plan came out during the Great Depression. If you Google Chicago Plan, you'll get housing plans. If you Google Paul Douglas Chicago Plan, you'll probably get, that's on my website and on a couple others. But they said we should lend, government should issue all the money, it should lend it to the banks once. All the money that banks created out of thin air, they should have to borrow to cover that money. And the national debt ends up being roughly equal to the amount of money banks have created out of thin air. The third one is to pay rent. So if you're Ireland, Ireland didn't lose its land by selling it. Ireland lost its land because England took it. So it's a dramatic thing, but Ireland has been a net exporter. The solution to the Irish problem, this was an Irish newspaper, was you're starving here in Ireland, go to America. Well, England had been buying up America. We were net importers for the first 60 or 70 years of existence in the United States. We were importing goods and selling land to English interests. And so they did the same thing to us that Japan was doing, and only they did it in a much bigger way. England still owns way more land than Japan or China or the Arabs or anybody else because they got it when it was cheap. This is the Irish ships, you know, the coffin ships loading up to come to America. This was a cartoon. It's like a poorhouse on a boat. The progressive movement began with Irish Catholics in the United States. And it was not socialist at all. In fact, the socialists were constantly attacking the progressives. Terence Powderly took over the Knights of Labor, and they went from 60,000 to 700,000 in 1 year. One of their platform planks was to get government to create all of the money, and with no intervention by banking corporations. Powderly went so far as to say if we did this, there would be no need for labor unions. And so what makes labor unions necessary is primarily banking monopoly and then land monopoly. And this is Henry George. Henry George is famous. All the classical liberals advocated this, but Henry George made a big deal of it. And he became the chief economist of the labor movement in the 1880s. And this quote, "The main all-absorbing question of the hour is the land question. Make your currency of whatever material you use, but if I own the land, you cannot base your currency on the wealth of the nation, for that wealth is in the land. And you may make the laws and own the currency, but give me the land and I will all absorb your wealth and render your legislation." And everybody who hears that quote thinks it was from Henry George, but that was also from Terence Powderly. These two issues are what makes free trade not free, because it's riddled with these two privileges. That was also Terence Powderly. Landlords rent us what was rightly our own land in the first place, because everybody has an equal right of access to land. Bankers lend us what is rightfully our own money in the first place, because the value of money is what we as productive people of the country created. Land value comes from the quality. You know, where people are highly productive, the land is very valuable. Land is a low value in slums because those people are too poor to actually be productive. The highest land value is not where rich people live. The highest land value is where middle-class, productive people live. And somebody says, no, that's not true. In the Pittsburgh area, he says, Sewickley Heights, a vacant lot or a piece of land is worth $2 million just for a vacant lot. And in Shadyside, the middle-class neighborhood in Pittsburgh, is worth, $200,000. They said, yeah, but that Shadyside lot is 1/10 of an acre. And your Sewickley Heights mansion area is 5-acre lots. So the land value is actually much higher in the high-density middle-class neighborhoods than it is where the rich people live. And part of it is those middle-class people, you want to do business, you want to do it in that middle-class neighborhood. So people create the value of money, people create the value of land. People will say, well, you don't have to own land. You can make a living working on computers. Well, who are your customers? Your customers own land. What are you going to eat? Somebody going to fax you a banana? You don't have to borrow money, but you have to earn money from somebody who borrowed it. So there's lots of parallels between these two that are very fundamental privileges. Land value fluctuates because the supply of land is fixed. Money, you try to make the value fixed, so the supply of money has to fluctuate. So that's a difference. And you can't survive without either one. And the final thing is that land rent should be used to replace taxes. All the classical liberals and early progressives, before socialism took the word progressivism, said that you should pay taxes according to how much of the commons you've taken out. And that includes royalties on oil. The people of Alaska get almost $2,000 a person because of the oil that comes out of Alaska, and that oil is the public's oil. Broadcast licenses, cable TV franchises, all those things are law-created property, and those are privileges that have been privatized. My view of it is nothing should be privatized, nothing should be socialized. If it's private in its nature, if individual human beings created through their labor, it's private. Leave it alone. If society created it in the first place, and that would be land value or the value of money, then it should remain public. And it can be money that's traded privately. Once it's issued, it should be yours. Brazil was the fourth category, and I want to mention something about Brazil. They borrowed money when oil was cheap, and to say they were going to industrialize on all this borrowed money, and just as they did, the price of oil went way up, and their industries depended on imported fuel, because Brazil did not have its own fuel sources. So Brazil was in debt to everybody, and they dumped. Cheap Brazilian steel flooded the market too, but they were doing that to get out of debt. So they were like Ireland, only instead of being tenants, they were debtors.
Any opportunities for questions or comments from the folks here?
So I might be slightly confused in my interpretation of one comment you made, but you mentioned something like oil being innately public, or something, oil being
oil
a
in the
natural
ground.
resource.
Yeah.
Right. So I'm thinking of an example, like say I owned a small piece of property and I'm interested in, for a living, mining it. I think that there are valuable natural resources in my property, and that requires labor for me to be able to do that. Would taxing or publicizing the wealth that is created by me trading, say, some ore that I find in the ground, disincentivize people from putting the labor into extracting it in the first place and making it something that is circulated as a valuable resource? Do you sort of understand what I'm saying? Yeah.
Yeah. And, Venezuela nationalized the oil, and it was a big collapse. Because they didn't just nationalize the mineral rights, they nationalized the actual oil industry. And they had no idea how to run it. And people who were running it were not working for themselves, they were working for the government. Alaska and also the western provinces of Alberta, when you buy land in those provinces, you're not buying the mineral rights in the first place. But if you want the mineral rights, you can lease them. And so Canada has a schedule that it's so much a barrel, you pay so much a barrel to pull oil out of Western Canada, and they index it to the world oil prices. So if the price of oil goes up, it's a windfall to Canada rather than a windfall to you. But if the price of oil goes down, it's Canada's loss, not your loss. And what you do in Alberta, Canada, is the one I know of. Anyone has a right to drill core samples. So you you drill core samples, and you know what's down there and nobody else does. And you turn that core sample into the Canadian government in a sealed envelope, and it remains sealed for 1 year. And during that year, you and anybody else can bid for the rights to drill that oil and get a 10-year lease to pull oil out of that area. But anybody who hasn't drilled their own core sample is bidding blind. So it's still an open competition, and people bid and they drill, and private enterprise does everything. But they pay Canada for the value of the oil in the ground and a royalty based on what they've extracted. And it ends up being free enterprise with the value of the commons still goes to Canada. That oil, as soon as it's out of the ground, is private property because you've added labor to it. It's, the oil down in the ground was the commons. The oil, and you paid for the right to access that oil. It's now your oil. And as much as you can pull out in the next 10 years is your oil because you got a lease. I don't know how they renew leases, whether they put it up for bid again or whether they have a mechanism for renewal. I haven't followed it that closely. But the idea is to, as much as possible, separate the return to entrepreneurship from the return to the basic land value that is there. And you can't assess, government doesn't have the intelligence to assess what the value of the oil is in the ground. In fact, the oil companies don't have the intelligence. Right. It's like 9 out of 10 wells they went, whoops. So, that's a high-risk speculative thing, and Canada has a good sense to just let private enterprise figure out what the value is.
So you mentioned in the case of Venezuela that they nationalized the oil industry as well as nationalizing the oil itself in the ground. And I'm thinking about that in terms of the analogy of banking and money creation, because some people would argue that you want to nationalize the banks in order to be able to have money creation controlled by the public sector.
Yeah.
But it seems to me that there's an interesting comparison here because many people argue, well, don't nationalize the banks, just nationalize money creation.
Yeah, there's people, the public banking movement and some other things that if government is in charge of who gets a loan, you think there's corporate politicking going on now. Wait till you see, well, your corporation, if your corporation has the favor of government, they can get really good deals on loans and they already have that, but I want somebody who's risk averse to be deciding you know, who qualifies for a loan. If there's small banks and the bank makes a bad loan, that bank loses that money. It's not me as a taxpayer that loses that money. And now, once it's a really big corporate bank, it starts to have the same problems. Every complaint you can make about socialism, you can also make about big corporations. Because big corporations separate ownership from control. The stock owners own it, they have no control. The president of the corporation controls it. He might own some of the stock, but he can do things that's good for him and his board of directors that are not good for the stockholders. And that's pretty much the same as the Communist Party doing what's good for the inner circle of communists, not doing what's good for the people. So there's a lot of similarities between really large corporations and socialist governments, that they get involved in things where they officially represent the interests of other people, but their own interests come to play. And that has more to do with tonight's thing, with the corporate efficiency. But yeah, does anybody have questions about land tax or about?
I'll do a land sale question. One thing you had mentioned with if you sell land, that land, either the money you can generate off of it or the appreciation of the ground grows faster than the money would if you were to invest that money or to put it in business. Are there situations where somebody can sell land, use that money they use to start a business or invest in some sort of business, have that growth be faster than the appreciation of the land, and then buy their land back, or just be better off in general?
Well, the idea was you would still buy and sell land exactly as you do now.
Right.
But as the tax on the land gradually went up and the tax on the building and on everything else gradually went down, buying the land to cash in the future would become less and less profitable.
Okay.
And investing would become more and more profitable because the taxes on productivity are coming down.
Right.
There's no magic line, though, because if you have inside information that the airport is going to be here, and it's a big, huge international airport, and the highway to the airport is going to be widened, and all this stuff, then in 5 years that land might be worth 1,000 times what it's worth now. Well, it would have to be a really, really high land value tax to make that not profitable.
Right.
So you did speculate on that land, but you would speculate by saying, okay, the day that airport opens, I'm going to have a hotel on that land. So you're still speculating on the land, but you're being more productive. And the smart thing to do is not worry about somebody getting something for nothing. The real problem is not that they get something, it's that they prevent progress from happening. So if somebody buys that land and says, in 5 years it's going to be worth 1,000 times as much, but even after the airport is up, in 10 years it's going to be 5,000 times as much. Well, at that point you're pushing it. And you're also holding back progress because somebody wants to put a hotel there, and it can't happen if you hold out beyond the point where the appropriate use is ready. Then that can't happen. So that's where you need enough land value tax to prevent that abuse, but you don't need enough. You don't need to collect the full rent.
What about hoarding money? Wouldn't that have a similar effect of preventing production? People who are accumulating wealth and just hoarding it and not...
It does now. Although people don't hoard money, they hoard debt. Coin collectors hoard money. But what most people do is they lend the money out and they keep getting interest on it. And the problem is that all collapses when people can't borrow anymore. But they don't hoard money per se, And if you had a system where the government issued all the money, and government, I would say my favorite way, there's different opinions on it, but my favorite way of government issuing money is to monitor the consumer price index and the producer price index, because there's other things that are leading indicators that say inflation is coming, and it's not here yet, but if this index is off, this one will be. But if governments constantly adjust the money supply for stable prices, then the best way to put money into the hands of the people is to lower the payroll taxes, because most people's payrolls are computerized. They get paid every 2 weeks. And you can adjust their withholding every time there's a paycheck. And if you just say, we're going to take, we need $50 million worth of new money to be put into circulation. So we're going to reduce the withholding in the aggregate by $50 million. That you might only get 30 cents more, but whatever it is, that increases your paycheck for that month. And the money is now in the hands of people who will spend it. Ordinary working people are living with paychecks. They're either going to spend it, save it, or pay off their debts. And if they spend it, the economy circulates. If they pay off their debts, then the banks can lend more money, because the banks, under the Chicago plan, the banks can only lend from deposits. Well, they've already lent you money, you're in debt to them. If you pay off your old debt, if they were allowed to lend that money to you, they're allowed to lend that money to somebody else. And if you save it, if you put it in a checking account, they can't do anything. The reform proposal is if that money's in a checking account and you can take it out whenever you want, then it's still your money, it's not the bank's money. But if you put the bank, if you put it in a term deposit, you get a certificate of deposit, and you say, I'm not going to take this money out for 10 years. I'm putting this toward my retirement fund, or when I buy a house, or something I want to do 10 years from now. Okay, they can lend that money out for 10 years. So there's still private lending going on. But yeah, the hoarding money was big when we had a gold standard, because there was only so much money. If the economy grew and the money supply didn't grow, we had deflation. We had periods of serious deflation in this country. And deflation is worse than inflation, because if there's inflation, you spend the money quickly. But if there's deflation, you don't spend the money at all. You say, I can invest this money in a business and make a 5% return, but if the money is increasing in value by more than 5%, then I'm actually better off to hold the money. So what you got to shoot for keeping the money value as stable as possible. A dollar should be a dollar, the same as a yard should be a yard, and a quart should be a quart. It's that kind of a concept.
This whole land value thing essentially optimizes the use of the land. It essentially fosters development, because you're not taxing the process of development of the products of human labor.
Right.
But one of the concerns that we have today is not encouraging development, but essentially protecting land so it doesn't get gobbled up in such a way as to be essentially ultimately damaging in the long run, because we don't have the natural capital, because the natural capital can be gobbled up in this way. So how do these concerns of sustainability impact on the kind of things you're talking about?
Well, one of the things is that the strategy under a land value tax is if you're going to develop, you want to take up no more land than you actually need. Because if you take up twice as much land, you pay twice as much tax. And the tax is going to be a lot, because we're talking about replacing a lot of other taxes with it. So you would want to you know, the people who are building housing, for example, they would not want to have 5-acre lots or 2-acre lots. They would want to have, you know, like the size lots in Athens here, you know, they would want to have small lots. There would be townhouses would be much more popular. Low-rise apartment buildings would be popular. Even high-rise apartment buildings would be more popular than they are now. And so the development draws inwards. We sprawl out into wilderness area and farmlands and stuff, not because people want to go farther up, but because that land is cheap. And the land that should be developed more intensely is expensive. So they leapfrog over that. And wilderness land would probably, except for people who want to log it, and there's you can treat logging like you treat oil. You can say, we're going to charge you so much to log, and we're going to charge you a whole lot more if you want to clear cut it, you know. But if you'll go in and pick the trees that are ready and leave the other ones to grow, we'll charge you a little less. But other than the loggers, nobody would really want to go out into that wilderness area except the hermits, and the hermits there aren't that many hermits, so they can live out there and pay no taxes at all, or pay almost no taxes.
Is that why development in Europe has been more concentrated in terms of the people living in towns rather than spreading out like we've done in this country? Is there an economic basis to that in terms of the way they do taxes?
I think it has more to do with the feudal lords having already monopolized the countryside. So ordinary people develop where they're allowed to develop. If you think real estate in California is expensive, you should look at Paris or London or Berlin, or, you know, they're just hugely expensive, and they have, you know, they still have a landed aristocracy that the system has been democratized, but the landed aristocracy figured out ways to maintain their advantage. Now, the Scandinavian countries have land value taxes to some degree. And Estonia has more land value tax than any other country in Europe. We went to the Soviet Union when communism collapsed. People went to the Soviet Union, and it was like swimming. We were like minnows swimming with the sharks. So I didn't go, but the people in the organizations I'm with went. But then we went to Estonia, and nobody was paying attention to Estonia, and we explained this to Estonia, and they did it. And they're very prosperous now. So.
My name is John Howell. I serve as coordinator of Democracy Over Corporations, one of the two organizations which sponsored Dan Sullivan's talk, entitled Land, Money, and Privilege Free Trade, given on September 18th on the Ohio University campus in Athens. Dan ran out of time during his talk and ended it rather abruptly without a summary or statement of conclusions. What follows is my summary of Dan's talk, prepared in consultation with Dan. First, on trade and land. The U.S. buys more goods from abroad than it sells. Much of the money we send abroad to pay for these goods is used to buy land in America or is lent back to America. The trade deficit of the 60s and 70s resulted in ownership of 40% of Los Angeles by Japanese businessmen. California's Proposition 13 of 1978 reduced property taxes, making it inexpensive to hold land. And within 18 months, foreign ownership of California land doubled. In contrast, between 1979 and 1990, Pittsburgh raised the land value tax to become 6 times higher than the tax on improvements, such as buildings, and experienced a building boom with no real estate price rise. Holding land, undeveloped, in Pittsburgh was expensive, and speculators were not interested. In 2008, California led the nation in mortgage foreclosures, and Pittsburgh had the fewest per capita. Owning land is a privilege made possible through government. Land titles did not exist before the state. Among American Indians, people had tenure on the land as long as they were directly using it. It was yours, at least until the harvest. Classical economists recognized property ownership, but within limits. John Locke said that you have a right to take up land as long as there is good land left to others. And Ricardo said that land monopolies caused starvation wages unless the rent was shared. A land value tax is a way of sharing rent. When such taxes are used to provide services which benefit everyone or reduce taxes on other things, such as labor. Second, on money. China's economy came on strong after land prices in California and elsewhere had risen. Instead of buying land, Chinese businessmen and banks primarily bought treasury bonds. That is, they loaned money to the U.S. government and collected the interest, which was a safe investment for them. The title to money, like the title to land, is created by the state. Globally, money is created by private banks as they make loans, a very special and lucrative privilege given to banks. This process controls the money supply. When the rate of lending rises, the money supply rises. When the rate of lending falls, the money supply shrinks, as it does during recessions and depressions. The actual value of money is created by producers. But when the money supply rises faster than the actual production of goods and services, prices rise. That is, we have inflation. Now, with inflation, the wealthy can invest in properties, the price of which will then rise without any input of effort and produce a handsome profit upon selling, leaving them unhurt by inflation. But inflation hurts low-income people who have nothing to invest. During the Civil War, the U.S. government created money, the greenbacks. It provided the resources for the North to carry out the war successfully. In order to address the causes of the economic collapse that caused the Great Depression, leading economists at that time proposed ending the special privilege which banks had to create money, and to have money created publicly by government. It was called the Chicago Plan. The idea was to let banks operate like other financial institutions and lend what money they actually have or what they can borrow. The plan was not implemented. People create the value of money, and people create the value of land. Both land and money should be considered part of the commons, the earth itself, and what is created by society at large. The profits from money creation should go to the public, either by way of public services or through a direct citizen's dividend, rather than to bank profits. The money from land should likewise go to the public through a land tax, which could reduce or eliminate other taxes. An example of land rent is that of the Alaska Permanent Fund, which provides a citizen's dividend to every Alaskan based on the value of the oil taken from the earth. Similar taxes should be paid up front for the use of the airwaves. One should basically pay taxes in accordance with how much of the commons one uses or has taken out. In summary, appropriate access to the commons is necessary for a just and sustainable society.